Hi friends, today we are going to see about the topic The World Without Us, a lingering scent of Eden. You may never have heard of Bialowarzi Pusasa, but if you were raised somewhere in the temperature swath that across much of North America, Japan, Korea, Russia, several former Soviet republics are parts of China, Turkey, Eastern and the Western Europe, including the British. Sometimes within you remembers it. If instead you were born to a desert, subtropics or tropics, pambas or savannas, there are still places on the earth kindring to this to stir your memories too. An old Polish word means forest primal. Straddling the border between Poland and Belarus, the 500,000 acres of Białowieża contains Europe's last remembering farmlands of old growth, lowland wilderness. Think of the misty, brooding forest that loomed behind your eyelids when, as a child, someone read by the Grimm brothers' fairy tales. Here, ash and linden trees tower nearly 150 feet, their huge canopies shading a moist, tangled understory of hornbeams, ferns, swamp alders, and crocky sides fungi. Oaks, shrouds with a half a millions of mosses, grows so immense here that great spotted woodpecker store suppressed cones in their 3 inches deep brook furrows. The air, thick and cool, is draped with the silence that part briefly of a nutcracker's croak, a pygrim wolf low whistles or a wolf wail, then return to the stillness. The fragrance that wafts from eons of accumulated mulch in the forest core hearkens to fertility over origins. In the Białowieża, the profusing of life owes much to all that is dead. Almost a quarter of the organic masses above ground is in associate stage of decay. More than 50 cubic yards of decomposing trunks and fallen branches on every acre, nourishing thousands of species of mushroom, lynchers, bark beetles, grubs, and the microbes that were missing from their orderly managed woodlands that passes as forest elsewhere. Together, those spices stock a sylvan ladder that provides for weasels, pine martens, raccoons, badgers, otters, fox, lynxes, wolves, coyotes, elks, and eagles. More kind of a life are found here than anything else on the continent. Yet there are no surrounding mountains or sheltering valleys to form unique niches for epidemic species. The Białowieża is simply a relic of what once stretched east to Siberia and west to Ireland. The existence in the Europe of such legacy of unbroken biological antiquity owes, unsurprisingly, to high privilege. During the 14th century, a duke named Jagiellio, having successfully allied his Grand Duchy with the Kingdom of Poland, declared the forest a royal hunting preserve. For centuries, it stayed that way. When the Polish-Lithuanian Union was finally summoned by Russia, the Białowieża became the private domain of the stars. although occupying Germans took lumber and gladiators game during World War I. A Princeton core was left intact, which is 1921 became a Polish national park. The timber picklaying resumed briefly under the Soviets, but when the navals invaded, a nature fanatics named Hermann Göring decided the entire premises off limits except by his pleasure. Following World War II, a reportedly drunken Joseph Stalin agreed one evening in Warsaw to let Poland retain two-fifths of the forest. Little else changed under the communist rule, except for the construction of some elite haunted datches, in one of which is Visculi. An agreement was signed in 1991 dissolving the Soviet Union into free states. Yet, as it turns out, this ancient sanctuary is more threatened under Polish democracy and pluralism independence than it was during 7 centuries of monarchy and the dictators. Forestry ministers in both countries taught increased management to preserve the Pusaza's health. Management, however, often runs out to be enthusiasm for culling and selling. Mature hardworks that otherwise would one day return a windfall of nutrient to the forest. It is thrilling to think that all Europes once look like the Puzusa. To enter it is to realize that the most of us were bred to pale copy of what nature intended. Seeing elders with the trunks 7 feet wide or walking through stands of the tallest trees here, gigantic Norway structures, shaggy, should seem as exotic as the Amazon or Antarctica to someone raised among the comparatively puny. Second growth woodlands found throughout the northern hemisphere. Instead, what astonishing is how primarily familiar it feels, and on some cellular level, how complete. Andres recognized it instantly. As a forestry student in Karvok, he had been trained to manage the forest for maximum productivity, which includes removing excess organic little lest it hardens pests like bark beetles. Then on a visit here, he was stunned to discover 10 times more biodiversity than in any forest he had ever seen. It was the only place left with all 9 European woodpecker species, because he realized some of them only nest in hollow, dying trees. They can't survey in managed forest. He argued to his forestry professors. The Baya Loviza has managed itself perfectly well for millennia. The husky bearded young Polish foresters became instead a forest ecologist. He was hired by the Polish National Park Service. Eventually, he was fired for protecting the management plans that chipped ever closer to the persistence core of the Bialowieza. In various international journals, he blistered official policies that asserted that forests will die without our thoughtful help, or that justified cutting timbers in the Bialowieza surrounded buffer to re-establish the primeval characters of stands. Such convoluted thinking, he assumed, was rampant among the Europeans who had hardly any memory of forested wildness. To keep his own memory connected for years, he daily laced his leather boots and hiked through his beloved Puzusa. Yet, although he is furiously depends those parts of this forest still undisturbed by a man, Andrews can't help being scheduled by his own human nature. Alone in the woods, Borges enters into communication with the fellow Homo sapiens through the ages. A wilderness this pure is a blank slate to record human passage. A record he has learned to read. Charcoal layer in the soil show him where gamesmen once used fire to clear parts of the forest for browse. Stands of the bridge and trembling aspens asserts to a time when Jagolio descendants was distracted from hunting, perhaps by war long enough for the sun seeking species to recognize game's clearing. In their shade grow a telltale seedling of the hardwoods that were here before them. Gradually, there will be a crowd out of the bridge and the aspen until it will be as if they were never gone. Whenever biopic happens on an anonymous shrubs like half-thorns or on a old apple tree, he knows he is in the presence of the ghost of a log house long ago devoted by the same microbes that can turn the giant trees here back into the soil. Any lone, massive oaks he finds growing from a low, clover covered mound marks a cemeterium. Its roots have drawn nourishment from the ashes of salvic ancestors of today's Breclorianism, who came from the east 900 years ago. On the northwest edges of the forest, Jews from 5 surrounding shelters buried their dead. Their sandstones and the granite headstones from the 1850, a mossy and tumbled by roots, have already worn so smooth that they have begun to resemble the pebbles left by their mourning relatives, who themselves long ago departed. Andrews Bobic passes through a blue-green glade of Scott pine, barely mile from the Brulosian borders. The warning October afternoon is so hushed. He can hear the snowflakes alight. Suddenly, there was a clashing in the underbrush, and a dozen vision, that is, bison bonus, European bison, burst from where they have been browsing on your shoots, steaming and pawing their huge black eye glance just long enough for them to do what is their own ancestors discovered they must upon encountering one of those despectively frail pidots. They flew. Just 600 visons remains in the wild, nearly all of them here or just half, depending on what mean by here. And iron curtains beside this paradise erected by the Soviets in 1980s. Along the border to the Traverse escapes to the Poland residents' solitary movement. Although wolf digs under it and roadies and the elk are believed to leap it, the herd of the largest of Europe mammals remains divided, and with it its gene pool divided and mortality diminished. Some zoologists fears. Once following the World War I, bison from the zoos were brought here to replenish a species nearly extirpated by the hungry soldiers. Now a remnant of a Cold War threatens them again. Belarus, which well after communism collapses, has yet to remove the status of Lenin, also shows no inclination to the dismantle defences, especially as Poland's border is now the European Union, although just 14 kilometers separates the two countries' par headquarters. To see the Belorusslavia, as it is called as Belorism, a foreign visitors must drive 100 miles south, take a train across the border to the city of Brest, submit to the pointless integrations, and hire a car to drive back north. Andros Boy's Belarusian counterpart and fellow activities. Hero Halik is a pale, swallow, invertebrate biologist and a former deputy director of Birolist sites of the primal forest. He was also fired by his own country's park service for challenging one of the largest parks additions, a sawmill. He cannot risk being seen with the Westerns inside the Brennanshaw's treatments where he lives at the forest edge. He apologetically offers visitors tea and discusses his dream of an international peace park where bison and the moose would roam and breed freely. The Pusha's colossal trees are the same as those in the Poland, the same buttercups, liches, and the enormous red oak leaves, the same circling white-angled eagles, headless of the razor wire barrier below. In fact, on both the sides, the forest is actually growing. As peasants, populations leave shrinking villages for cities. In this moist climate, birch and the aspens quickly invade their fallow potato field within just 2 decades. Farmlands give way to woodlands. Under the cacophony of the pioneering trees oak, maple, linden, elm, and the spur generates. Give 500 years without people, a true forest could return. The thought of a rural Europe reverting one day to the original forest is heartening. But unless the last human remembered to first remove Durrell's iron curtain, its bestowed may wither away with them. Unbuilding our home. If you want to destroy a barn, a farmer once told me, cut an 18-inch square hole in the roof, then stand back. On the day after human disappear, natures take over and immediately begin cleaning house or houses. That's it. Cleans them right off the face of the earth. They all go. If you are a homeowner, you already knew it and was only a matter of time of years. But you have resisted admitting it. Even a erosion colossi attacked, starting with your savings, back when they told you what your house would cost. Nobody mentioned what you would also be paying so that the nature wouldn't repossess it long before the bank. Even if you like in a denatured postmodern subdivision where heavy machines mash the landscapes into submission, replacing unruly native flora with the obedient sod and uniforming saplings and paving a wetland in the righteous name of an mosquito control. Even then, you know that the nature was phased. No matter how hermetically you have sealed your temperature tuned interior from the weather, invisible spore penetrates anyway, exploding in sudden outburst of a mold, awful when you see it, worse when you don't, because it's hidden behind a painted wall, munching paper, sandwiches of a gypsum board, rotting studs on the floor joist, or you have been colonized by the termist, carpenter ant, roaches, haunters, even small mammals. Most of all, though you are the bestest, by what in the other contest is the revisable stuff of life water. It always wanted. After we are gone, nature's revenge for our smug, mechanized superiority arrives water-borne. It starts with wood frame construction, the most widely used residential building techniques in the developed world. It begins on the roof, probably aspects or slate shingle, warranted to the last 2 or 3 decades. But the warranty doesn't count around the chimney, where the first leak occurs. As the flashing separates under rain, relentless instance, water sneaks beneath the shingles. It flows across the 4 by 8 foot sheets of sheeting made either of ply or, if we never, of wood chips, broad composed of 3 to 4 inches flags of timber bonded together by a resin. Newer isn't necessarily better. Joachim von Braun, the German scientist who developed the US space program, used to tell a story about a Colonel John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth. Second, before he lifted off with the Glenn strapped into the rocket we built for him, and man's best efforts all focused on that moment. You know what he said to himself? Oh my God, I am sitting on a pile of low bids. In your new house, you have been sitting under one. On the one hand, that's all right. By building things so cheaply and lightly, we use fewer of the world resources. On the other hand, the massive trees that yielded the great wooden post and beam that still support medieval Europeans, Japanese and early American walls are now too precious and rare, and we are left to make to do with a glancing together smaller boards and scraps. The reasons in your cost conscious choices of a wooden chips roof, a waterproof gauze of a formylaic and a phenol polymer was also applied along the board's exposed edges, but it fails anyways because moisture enters around the nails. Soon they have rusting and their grips begin to loosen. That present leads not only to interior leaks but to the structural mayhems. Beside underlying the roofings, the wooden sheeting secures trusses to each others. The trusses, pre-manufactured braces held together with metal connection plates, are there to keep the roof from spilling. But when the sheathing goes, structural integrity goes within it. As gravity increases, tension on the trusses, the half-inch pins securing their non-rusting connectors plates full free from the wet woods, which now sporty a fuzzy coating of greenish mold. Beneath the mold, thread-like filaments called hyphae are creating enzyme that break the cellulose and lignin down into fungi foods. The same thing is happening to the floor inside. When the heat went off, pipes burst. If you live where it freezes, and rain is blowing in where windows have cracked from the bird collisions and the stress of gassing walls, even where the glass is still intact, rains and so mysterious inexorably work there under sills. As the wood continues to rot, trusses start to collapse against each other. Eventually, the walls lean to one side and finally the roof falls in. That brand roofs with the 18 by 18 inches hole was likely gone inside of 10 years. Your house lost maybe 50 years, 100 tops. While all the disaster was unfolding, squirrels, raccoons, and the lizards have been inside, chewing nest holes in the dry walls. Even a woodpecker rammed their way through from the other direction. If they were initially thwarted by the alligator in distributions, sidling made of aluminium, vinyl, or the maintenance free Portland cement, cellulose, fiber, clubboards known as hide pranks. They were merely have to wait a century before most of it is lying on the ground. Its factory impregnated colors is nearly gone, and as water its inevitable way into saw cuts and holes where the plants took nails, bacteria are picking over its vegetable matter and leaving its mineral behind. Fallen vinyl siding, whose colors begin to fade yearly, is now brittle and cracking as it is plasticizes degenerate. The aluminium is in a better shape, but salt is water pooling on its surface slowly. Eats little pits that leaves a grainy white coating. For many decades, even after being exposed to the elements, zinc has protected your steel and heating and cooling ducts. But water and air have been conspiring to convert into zinc oxide. Once the coating is submerged, the unprotected thin sheet steel disintegrated into few years. Long before that, the water soluble gypsum in the sheetrock has washed back into the earth. That leaves the chimney where all the trouble begins. After a century, it's still standing, but its bricks have begun to drop and breaks as little by little. Its lime mortar, exposed to the temperature swings, crumbles and the powders. If you own a swimming pool, it's now a planter box filled with either the half springs of ornamental saplings that the developer imported, or with the banished nature foliage that was still hovering on the subdivision fingers, awaiting the changes to retake its territory. If the house foundation involved a basement, its too is filling with the soil and the plant life. Brahms and the wild grapevines are snacking around the steel gas pipes, which will rust away before another century goes by. White plastic PVC plumbing has yellow and thinned out on the side exposed to the light, where its chloride is weathering to hydrochloric acid, dissolving itself and its polyvinyl partners. Only the bathroom tiles the chemical properties of its fired ceramic, not unlike those of fossils. It's relatively unchanged, although it is now lies in a pile mixed with leaf litter. After 500 years, what is left behind depends on where in the world you lived. If the climate was temperature, a forest stands in the place of the suburbs. Minus a few hills, it begins to resemble what it was before developers or the farmers they exploited first saw it. Amid the trees, half concluded by spreading understory, lie aluminium dishwasher parts and the stainless steel cookwares, their plastic handles splitting but still solid. Over the coming centuries, although there will be no metallurgist around to measure it, the pace at which aluminium pits and the corrollates will finally be revealed. A relatively new material, aluminium was unknown to early humans because its ore must be electrochemically refined to form metal. The chromium alloy that gives stainless steels its resistance, however, will probably continue to do so for millennia, especially if the pots, pans, and the carbon tempered cutleries are buried out of reach of atmospheric oxygen. 100,000 years hence, the intellectual development of whatever creature digs them up might be kicked abruptly to a higher evolutionary plan by the discovery of ready-made tools. Then again, a lack of knowledge of how to duplicate them could be demoralizing frustration or an avaricious mystery that ignites religious consciousness. If you were a desert dweller, the plastic components of a modern life flake and peel away faster as polymer chain cracks under a ultraviolet barrage or daily sunshine. With less moisture would last longer there, though any metals in contact with salty desert soil will corrode more quickly. Still, from Roman ruins, we can guess that the quick thick cast iron will be around well into the future archaeological records. So the odd prospects of fire hydrant sprouting amidst Cactic may someday be among the few clues that humanity was here, although adobe and the plaster walls will have eroded away. Through wrought iron balconies and the window grates that one adorned them may still be recognizable. Alibut, airy as tool, as corrections eating through the iron, encounters its matrix of indigestible glass slag. Once we build structures entirely from the most durable substances we knew. Granite blocks, for instance, the results are still around today to admire, but we don't often emulate them because quarrying, cutting, transporting, and fitting stones required a patience we no longer possess. No one since the likes of Antonio Gull, who begins a Braclonis is unfinished Sagrada Familia Basilica in 1880, contemplates investing in constructions that our great grandchildren's grandchildren will complete 250 years hence, nor absence the availability of a few thousand slaves is it cheap, especially compared to another Roman invention, concentrate. Today, that brew of a clay, sand, and a paste make of a calcium of ancient seashells hardened into a man-made rock that is increasingly the most affordable opinion for Homo sapiens urbans. What happened then to the cement? Cities now home to more than half the human alive. Before we consider that, there is a matter to address regarding climate. If we were to vanish tomorrow, the momentum of certain forces we have already set in the motion will continue until centuries of gravity, chemistry, and the entropy slows them to an equilibrium that may only partially resemble the one that excited before us. That former equilibrium depends on a seizable amount of carbon locked away beneath Earth's crust, much of which we have now relocated into the atmosphere. Instead of rotting, the wooden frames of houses may be preserved like the timbers of a Spanish galleons wherever rising sea pickles them in a salt water. In a warmer world, the deserts may grow drier, but the parts where human dwelt will likely again be visited by what attracts those humans in the first place. Flowing water From Cairo to Phoenix, desert cities rose where rivers made arid soil liable. Then, as a population grows, human sized control of those aquatic arteries, diverting them in a way that allowed for even more growth. But after people are gone, the diversion will soon follow them. Drier, hotter desert climates will be complemented by wetter, stormier mountains weather system that will send floods roaring down streams, overwhelming dams, spreading over the former alluvial plains, and entombing the whatever was built there in annual layers of a slit. Within them, fire hydrant, truck tires, shattered plate glasses, condominium, and office buildings may remain indefinitely. But as far as from the site as the carbonizers formation one was, no memorial will mark their burial, though the root of a cottonwoods, willows, and the palms may occasionally make notes of their presence. Only eons later, when old mountains have worn away and new ones risen, will young streams cutting fresh canyons through sedimental reveal what once briefly went on here. The city without us. The nation that somebody nature could swallow whole, something so colossal and concentrate as modern city doesn't slide easily into our imaginations. The sheer titanic presence of a New York City resists effort to the picture it wasting away. The event of September 2001 showed only what human being with explosive hardware can do. Not crude processes like erosions or rot, the breathtaking shift collapse of the World Trade Center towers suggested more to us about their attacks than about mortal vulnerabilities that could doom on our entire infrastructures, and even that once inconceivable calamity was confined to just a few buildings. Nevertheless, the time it would take nature to get rid itself of what urbanity has worth may be less than we might suspect. In 1939, a World's Fair was held in New York. For it exhibits the government of the Poland, a statue of Wildslaw. Wildslaw, the founder of a Bielorussia, has not been immortalized in bronze for preserving chunks of primeval forest 6 centuries earlier. By marrying its queen, Jalio has united Poland and his Duchy of Lithuania into European powers. The sculpture portrays him on horseback following his victory at the Battle of Gunwald in 1410. Triumphant, he hosts 2 sword capture from the Poland latest vanquished enemy, the Teutonic Knights of the Cross. In 1939, the Poles weren't faring so well against some descendants of those Teutonic Knights. Before the New York World's Fair ended, Hitler Nazis has taken the Poland and the sculptures wouldn't be returned to its homeland. 6 sad years later, the Polish government gave it to the New York as a symbol of its courageous, betrayed survivors. The statue of a Gigilio was placed in the Central Park overlooking what today is called Turtle Pond. when Dr. Eric Sanderson's lead a tour through the park, he and his folks usually pass Jayaliko without pausing because they are lost in another century altogether. The 17th. Bicicleted under his white brimmed felt hat, a trim beard graying around his chin, and a laptop jammed in his backpack, Sanderson is a landscape ecologist with the Wildlife Conservation Society, a global squadron of researchers trying to save an imperiled world from itself. At its Bronx Zoo headquarters, Sandersons direct the Mahanta project, an attempt to recreate virtually Mahantaman Islands as it's when Henry Hudson crew first saw it in 1609, a pre-urban vision that tempts speculation about how a postman further might look. His team has scored original Dutch documents, colonial British military maps, topographic surveys, and centuries of assorted archives throughout the Rhone. They have probed sediments, analyzed fossil plants, and plugged thousands of bits of biological data into an imagining software that generates three-dimensional panoramas of the heavily wooded wilderness on which a metropolis was juxtaposed. With each new entry of a species of a grass or a tree that it is historically conformed in some parts of the city, the images grow more detailed, more startling, more convincing. Their goal is a block by city block guide to its ghost forest, the one Eric Sanderman unkindly seems to see even while adorning Fifth Avenue buses. When Sanderson wanders through a central park, he is able to look beyond the 500,000 cubic yard of soil hauled in by its designers. Frederick Law Olmsted and the Cavelet walks to fill in what was mostly a swanny bog surrounded by poison oak and sumac. He can trace the shorelines of the long, narrow lake that lay along what is now 59th Street, north of a Plaza Hotel, with its tidal outlet that meandered through Salt Marsh to the East River. From the west, he can see a pair of streams entering the lake that drain the slope of a Manhatta's major ridgeline. A deer and a mountain lion trail known today as Broadway. Eric Sanderson's see water flowing everywhere in the town, much of its building from underground, which is how Spring Street's gone its name. He is identified more than 400 brooks and streams that transported what was once hilly or rocky island in the Algonquian tongue of its first human occupants, the Lennox. Manahatta referred to those now vanished hills when New York 19th century planners imposed a grid on everything north of Greenwich Village. The jumble of the original streets to the south became impossible to an unsral. They behaved as its topography were irrelevant, except for some massive unmovable shits, outcrops in central parks and at the island's northern tips. Manhatta's rexurous terrains was squashed and dumped into stream beds, then planned and leveled to receive the advancing city. Later, the new counters arose, this time routed through the rectilinear form and hard angles, much as the water that once sculptured the island's land was now forced underground through a lattice of pipes. Eric Sanderson's Mannahatta project have plotted how closely the modern sewer system follows the old water courses. Although man-made sewer lines can't wick away the runoff as efficiently as nature. In a city that buried its river, he observes rain still falls. It has to go somewhere. As it happens, that will be a key to breaching Manhanda's hard shell. If natures set about dismantling it, it would begin very quickly with the first strike at the city's most vulnerable spot, its underbelly. New York City Transit Paul Schubbers and Pet Brifa, superintendent of hydraulic and level of 1 maintenance superior of a hydraulics emergency response, respectively, understand perfect how this world work. Every day, they must keep 13 million gallons of water from overpowering New York subway tunnels. That's just the water that already underground. Notes Scrubber. When it's rain, the amount is Brifa shows his plums surrounding it is incalculable. Maybe not actually incalculable, but it doesn't rain any less now than before the city was built. Once Manhattan was 27 square miles of porous ground interlaced with living rods that chiffoned the 47.2 inches of an average annual rainfall up trees and into meadow grasses, which dark their fill and exalt the rest back into the atmosphere. Whatever the root didn't take settled into the island's water table. In a place, it surfaced in the lake and the marshes with the excess draining off to the ocean via those 40 streams, which now lies trapped beneath the concentrate and asphalts. Today, because there is a little soil to absorb rainfall or vegetation to transpire it, and because building a block sunlight from evaporating it, rain collects its puddles or follows a gravity down sewers, or it flows into a subway vents, adding to the water already down there below 131st Street as and Lenox Avenue, for example. A rising underground river is corroding the bottom of A, B, C and D subway lines. Constantly, men in reflecting vest and the denim rough outs like Subbers and Biferias are clambering around beneath the city to deal with the fact that under New York groundwater is always rising. Whenever it rains hard, shivers clogged with the storm debris. The number of plastic garbage bags adrift in the world's cities may truly exceeds calculation, and the water needing to go somewhere plops down the nearest subway stairs, adds a nor'easter, and the surging Atlantic Ocean banks against New York water table until, in places like Water Street in the lower Manhattan or Yankee Stadium in the Bronx, it backs up right into the tunnels, shutting everything down until it subsides. Should the ocean continue to warm and rise even faster than the current inch per decade, at some point it's simply won't subside. Schubbers and the Brifa have no idea what will happen then. Add on to all that the 1930s vintage water mains that frequently burst, and the only thing that has kept New York from flooding already is the intense violence of its subway crews and 753 pumps. Think about those pumps. New York's subway system, an engineering marvel in 1903, was laid underneath an already existing burgeoning city. As that city already have a swellers line, the only place for the subways to go was below them. So explained the Shabbos, we have to pump uphill. In this New York it's alone. Cities like London, Moscow and the Washington build the subways far deeper, often to double as bomb shelter. Therein lies much potential disaster. Shading his eyes with his white hat, Scrubbers pierced down into a square pit beneath the Van Schillens Avenue station in Brooklyn, where each minute 650 gallons of natural groundwater gushes from the bedrock. Gesturing over the roaring cassites, he indicated four submersible cation pumps that takes runs laboring against gravity to stay ahead. Such pumps run on electricity. When the power fails, things can get difficulty very fast. Following the World Trade Center attack, an emergency pump train beginning a jumbo portable diesel generator pumped out 27 times the volume of a Shea stadium. Has the Hudson River actually burst through the path tunnel that connects the New York subway to New Jersey, as was greedily feared? The pump trains and the possibly much of the city would simply have been overwhelmed. In an abandoned city, there would be no one like a Paul Scrubber and Peter to race from the station to flooded station whenever more than 2 inches of the rain falls, as happened lately with disturbing frequency, sometimes snaking horses up straight away to pump to a shiver down the street. Sometimes navigating these tunnels in inflatable boats. With no people, there would also be no power. The pumps will go off and stay off. When the pump facility shutdowns, say Scrubbers, in half an hour the water reaches a level trains can't pass anymore. Brifa removes his safety goggles and rubs his eyes. A flood in one zone would push water into the others. Within 36 hours, the whole thing could fill. Even if it weren't raining, with subway pumps still, that would take no more than a couple of a day, they estimate. At the point, water would start suckling away the soil under the pavement. Before long, streets started to cracker with no one unlogging sewers, some new water sources from on a surface. Other appears suddenly as a waterlogged subway cleansing collapse. Within 20 years, the water-soaked steel columns that supports the street above the east sides 4, 5 and 6 trains corrodate and buckle. As Livingston's avenues cave in, it becomes a river. Well, before then, however, pavement all over the town would have already been in trouble. According to Dr. Jamil Ahmed, chairman of the Civil Engineering Department at New York's Corporation Union, things will begin to fall apart during the first month of the March after humans vacate Manhattans. Each March, temperature normally flutters back and forts around 32 degrees Fahrenheit as many as 40 times. Whenever it is, the repeated freezing and the thawing make asphalts and cement splits. When snow thaws, water seeps into these fresh cracks. When it freezes, the water expands and the cracks widen. Call its water relatations for being swashed under all the city space. Almost every other compounds in the nature contracts when the frozen, but H2O molecule do the opposite, organizing themselves into elegant hexagonal crystals that takes up to about 9% more space than they did when sluggish around in a liquid state. Pretty six-sided crystal suggested snowflakes, so a gossamer's it hard to convince of them pushing apart slabs of sidewalks. It even's more difficult to imagine carbon steel water pipes built to withstand 7,500 pounds of pressure per square inch exploding when they freeze. Yet that's exactly what happens. As pavement separates, weeds like mustard, shamrocks, and the goosegrasses blown in from the central parks and works their way down the new cracks, which widen further. In the current world, before they go get in too far, city maintenance usually shows up, kills the weeds, and fills the fissures. But in the post people worlds, there is no one left to continually path New York. The weeds are followed by the city's most prolific exotic species, the Chinese ailanthus tree. Even with 8 million people around, ailanthus, otherwise innocently known as the tree of heaven, or incapable invaders capable of rooting into tiny chinks in subway tunnels, unnoticed until their spreading leaves canophonics start poking from sidewalk grades. With no one to young their seedlings, within 5 years, powerful Anakin's roots are heaving up sidewalks and wearing havoc in sewers, which are already stressed by all the plastic bags and the old newspaper must that no one is clearing away. As soil long trapped beneath the pavement gets exposed to the sun and the rain, other species jump in and soon leaf litters adds to the rising piles of debris calling the Swigger graters. The yearling pioneer plants won't even have to wait for the pavement to fall apart. Starting from the mulch collecting in the gutter, a layer of a soil will start forming atop New York's sterile hard shell and seedling with sprout. With far less organic material available to it, just wind-blown dust and urban soot. Presumably, that has happened in an abandoned elevated iron bed of the New York Central Railroad on Manhattan's west side. Since train stopped running there in 1980s, the inevitable ailanthus tree have been joined by thickening grounds, cover of onion grass, and fuzzy lamp ears accented by stands of a golden rod. In some places, the track emerges from the second story of a warehouse it once serviced into elevated lanes of wild crocus risers, evening prime roses, assets, and the Queen Anne's Lake. So many New Yorkers glancing down from the window in Chestila's art district were moved by the sight of its unpatterned, flowering green ribbon prohibitively and swiftly laying claims to a dead slice of their city, that it was dubbed the High Line and officially designated a park. In the few years, with no heat, pipes burst all over the town, the freeze-thaw cycle moves indoor and things starts to seriously decorate building grounds as their innards expands and contracts. Joints between the walls and the roof lines separates. Where they do, rain leakins, blot rust, and phasing pops off, exposing insulations If the city hasn't burned yet, it will now. Continuatively, New York architecture isn't as composable as, say, San Francisco integratory row of clapboard Victorians, but with no fireman to answer the call. A dry lightning strike that ignites a decade of dead branches and leaves piling up in the Central Park will spread flames throughout the street. Within 2 decades, lightning rods have begun to rust and snap, and roof fires the leap among the buildings, entering plain offices filled with the paper fuel. Gas ignites with a rush of flames that blows out window. Rain and the snow blows in, and soon even poured concrete floors are freezing, thawing, and started to buckle. Burnt insulations and charred wood add nutrition to Manhattan's growing soil cap. Native Virginia creeper and the poison ivy claws at the walls covered with lynches which thrive in the absence of air pollutions. Red-tailed hawks and progine falcons nest in increasingly sketchy high-rise structures. Within 2 centuries, estimates Brookline Botanical Garden Vice President Stephen Clements, coralizing the trees will have substantially replaced pioneer weeds. Grutter, buried under tons of leaf, little provide new, fertile ground for native oaks and maple from city parks. Arriving block, lotus, and autumn olives, shrubs, fix nitrogens, allowing sunflowers, blossoms, and white snake roots to move in along with the apple tree, their seeds expelled by proliferating birds. Biodiversity will increase even more, predict Cooper Union Civil Engineering Chair Jamil Ahmad as buildings tumble and smash into each other's and the lime from the crushed concentrate raises soil pH, inviting in trees such a buckthorn and the bridges that needs less acidic environment. Ahmad, a hard silvered haired man whose hands talk in dissipative circles, believe that progress will begin faster than the people might think. A native of Lahore, Pakistan, a city of an ancient mosaic encrusted mosque, he now teaches how to design a retrofit building to withstand the terrorist attack and has to accurate a keen understanding of a structural weakness. Even building anchors into a hard Mahant shinist like most New York skyscrapers, he notes, weren't intended to have their steel foundations waterlogged. Plugged speeders, dingled tunnels, and street writing to the rivers, he says, will conspire to undermine sub-basements and destabilize their huge load. In a future that portends stronger and more frequent hurricanes striking North America's Atlantic coast, furious winds will pummel tall, unsteady structures. Some will topple, knocking down others. Like a gap in the forest when a giant tree falls, new growth will rush in. Gradually, the Alsop jungle will give way to real one.